So the US military has a drone problem, and the solution may be in Ukraine. It's not the tech or the manufacturing, both items that we could tackle and scale tomorrow. It's adaptation. Warfare right now is changing faster than any time in history, and what works today may not work tomorrow. With how long it takes us to develop and deploy new technologies, it's likely that what we roll out to our soldiers is best case, no longer the ideal solution. Worst case, it's already outdated, bordering on useless. Now, one company that's working to resolve this issue of rapid adaptation is Delian. Delian is a European defense company that builds their products in Ukraine based on real-time feedback from the front and are showing how this method could be adopted by other countries around the world. So today we're joined by Mark Melhorn, the head of air systems at Delian, to better understand what they're doing and how it could be a model for more companies to follow. And with that, let's get to the conversation. All right, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time, man. We got connected a couple weeks ago, and it's really cool what you guys are doing here. So excited to dive in, not just about the tech, but also kind of the way you're building all of this in Ukraine.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for having me on, Preston. Really a real privilege. So what we're doing in terms of the tech, we came out to Ukraine about a year ago, and were basically told they really needed a low-cost GNSS-denied navigation system that was scalable for them. We have a founder with a background in GNSS-denied systems, and we knew we could solve this problem using really low-cost, resilient supply chain components, to make it scalable. We also applied.
Real quick, GNSS, that's the Russian GPS. So it's when
GNSS
Russia
is the catch-all term for GPS.
Okay.
So GPS is one system, Galileo is another. GNSS covers all the different systems.
So in a jammed environment,
so
is kind of gotcha.
Something that no matter what's jammed or spoofed, it will still operate. And so we knew we could solve this, and we decided to take the approach that we would solve it for Ukraine, but we would do it using rules that would allow us to scale within NATO. So we said from the start, no Chinese supply chain. We are going to do this using components, friendshore components, ideally sovereign for us. And we were going to give ourselves the hard challenge of doing that, but doing it at the cost point that was affordable for Ukraine, so that one, we could help them scale, but secondly, we know that NATO's got to scale. I look at my country in the UK, and I see that the amount of money that's spent on exquisite systems, which we know are just not scalable, and we see how warfare is going, and quantity has a quality all of its own. So we gave ourselves that challenge. The system that we've built over the last year is a very small, low-cost system, which is a visual navigation system. It fuses visual inertial odometry. So what that is, it basically tracks movement within the device and then also looks at the ground and what's moving within the ground. And there's some very complex maths to work that all out. It does map matching. So it also looks at the ground, and where it sees an absolute position fix, it geolocates itself. And it fuses all that together to basically ensure that we can replicate a GNSS or a GPS signal to a drone, but we don't use any satellites. We use the terrain, we follow the terrain, we use very complex maths to calculate it all, but we use very cheap components. It's a completely passive system. It can't be jammed and spoofed to date. I'm sure cleverer people than me will find some way of doing it in the future. It doesn't emit. You can fly these missions, autonomously without having to maintain a radio connection or another connection to the drone, which means you're much harder to detect. EW can't pick it up. Clearly other systems may be able to pick it up. And we work very low. So we go down to, currently our floor is down an operating altitude of 70 meters, which means you stay below the radar horizon. So again, just trying to help solve those problems. And we're now, moving into the mass manufacture time. I've been out personally in Ukraine since the 1st of March, where we essentially had to get match fit to start with, get our algorithms match fit, and then get ourselves really, really robust because the users out here, they don't treat the system like you want it treated. They won't read the instructions. You've got to make it super simple and able to work in any condition. And they're the challenges that we've been facing. But the system that we've developed is this very small, smaller than an iPhone system that can basically be integrated within any drone that will allow it to navigate within GNSS that will allow it to navigate without GPS. But effectively, it's a very simple integration as well. Again, all these challenges that were presented to us by developing it, or rather refining it and further developing it on the ground, on a live battlefield, with users, with manufacturers, rather than us assuming what the problems were, them telling us the problems with our system, and then us being able to rapidly fix them, which meant we had to be here, we had to have our team here to fix it. And, they expect turnaround times of, the next day. You turn up, you flunk a test, or you do all right in a test and identify some problems. The next time you come back, and that might be the next day, you better have changed it. And if you show that level of, willingness to listen to them, to not think that you're right, to really understand what their problems are that they need to solve and go away and fix them, they really, really help you both understand what they're trying to do, but also understand how they will use that kit, because clearly we're not right at the front line, testing with them, when they're launching the missions, but we'll test with them in different environments, and they'll really explain to us how they're going to use it for real, and they'll use it in these environments like they're using it for real.
So you clearly have a connection already with the Ukrainian military. They are out there. Are you able to say whether these have been used operationally?
So we've done limited production here. Some of those have gone to manufacturers. We did the initial testing phase with them. Some of them have then gone to manufacturers, and then they go off and are used. I don't know where they've been used. Obviously, we get some feedback, but we don't necessarily know what happens to them after that.
I mean, just kind of reading between the lines. If the intent is to operate in a denied environment, there's a good way to test that out for the Ukrainian soldiers, right? So I'd imagine they're using it somewhere. Is this a strike platform, reconnaissance platform, a little of both?
So it can be we're on multiple different platforms.
That's right, because it's just a
component. Think of it like a component that will replace or be operated as an additional GPS on your system. And when that GPS gets jammed or spoofed, we won't be, and we can be relied upon to give a feed. So we're on lots of different platforms at the moment. Some of them are mid and deep strike platforms. Some of them have different use cases, because anything that can be flown autonomously, might need to do this. So if you can take operators out of the loop, then that's really, really helpful. So just like anybody in a benign environment can plan a route with a GPS or with a mission planner and then fly it on GPS, we essentially help them do that without. So, think of things like logistic resupply on the battlefield. That will be done. You don't need a pilot to fly that. If that's a pre-planned drop, you can fly to that location, even if it is jammed or spoofed, go to the right place, drop off what you need to drop, and then come back. And so there's lots of different missions. So it's not just strike. And actually, there are civilian companies that we're talking to. We haven't got contracts yet with that operate again similar things, logistics or whatever else. And we now know that there are large parts of the world where GPS is either flaky or is subject to regular jamming, and they need to be able to still operate their civilian service that they're providing.
You mentioned having to operate. One of the key constraints here being to operate at low cost. And it feels like in Ukraine, there's a couple different reasons for that. One, the US and the UK as well, and plenty of NATO countries probably overspends with a lot of the military equipment we buy and get the highest end stuff. But there's also the volume question where Ukraine just cannot spend, $70,000 on an FPV drone because they're going through 10,000 in a day. Are you able to talk cost at all? And maybe in a comparison, like what does the alternative look like compared with the low cost option you guys are providing?
Yeah, sure. So I'll try and give some comparisons to other systems that could potentially be used. And I'd start with the point, but you're right about the scale. I don't know what the official figure it is, but something like 4 million drones last year, going to be 10 million.
Jesus. Yeah.
It's just at a scale which is just, and these guys have revolutionized the way to think about war. They think about it as data analysts, and some of them, unmanned system forces have brought data analysts in when they formed the formation to run all the data for them. So they know exactly the cost of every mission. And it's about, if you want to be able to scale, you need to get, without the money changing, you need to be able to drive the cost of components and systems down to get that scale. So, with this sort of jamming that's been going on, jamming and spoofing, you've effectively been getting into a GPS / CRPA, more complex GPS war versus the jamming and spoofing. So, initially civilian GPS worked fine. Then jamming started. People went to more complex systems which had elements of protection. It might have been a dual band GPS system. Then there was some clever software put onto those systems, and they, you might be paying thousands, low thousands of dollars for those type of systems. That they very quickly stopped working. Then you started getting into the more complex CRP antennas, which are sort of 8 node, even 16 node, and then you're talking about $10,000 to $20,000 for an 8 node, potentially more for a 16 node system. We are talking about being about in the 1/10 of the price of those more exquisite CRPA antennas, and those CRPA antennas will work through a lot of the time, but through the really intense jamming or spoofing, they will still get jammed or spoofed. So they're not bulletproof. And what you actually find is that many OEMs, so UAV companies, or even units, people using the equipment, will want redundancy on their systems. So they will maybe want multiple different types of systems, or an inertial navigation system, where again you're talking in the tens of thousands of dollars on their system, as well as other bits to try and complement it. So what we're ideally liking to do as a standalone system is say, well, you can strip all that off, and we can work, be bulletproof for your entire mission. That's an amazing saving for them, and it will help them scale. More realistically, is they might have had CRPA, inertial navigation system. They might be able to strip off one of their systems and replace it with one of ours, and keep a CRPA and our system, for instance, to work together to do that, because the CRPA will be more accurate, especially when it's able to get a fix. They're incredibly accurate. However, we can get them through the elements where they're going to be jammed or spoofed, where they would fall over.
It's interesting how polar opposite that is. For most Western munitions and aircraft and UAVs, that amount would be a rounding error, less than a rounding error. But for these Ukrainian strike drones, it's the limiting factor. It could very quickly be the most expensive thing on there if it's at that same price point. It's so drastically different.
Yeah, and that's you're talking about the deep strike systems. They cost a big wedge of change still. So you might be talking certainly north of 100,000 for a deep strike system. You might be going a couple of 100,000 in that space. But then you get to the mid strike and see how they've revolutionized that. Previously, you were talking about exquisite systems like the Switchblade, was it the 600? Things like that. And so they could have very, very few of them. Their success rate, it's still not going to be perfect, anywhere near perfect, but it meant they could have very few of them. Now look at what the Hornet coming out of America has done. Widely banded around. I have no ground truth on it, but at $5,000, that means they can have a completely different scale. And if we're being brutally honest, it's probably way more effective because it's been developed in conjunction with the users out here. So it's really changed the game for them, because they know that not every system is going to get through. But if you can only afford to spend one exquisite system, and I use Switchblade there's loads of comparable examples of that in that mid space. knowing that you've got a 10% chance of doing it, but instead you can afford for the same amount of money to send 10 or 20 of them with the same chance of getting through, then your overall effectiveness, and that's what the key metric they're looking at then. What's the cost of the effect? And that's absolutely key. And they just, it's an incredibly different way of thinking about it. But I think we've got to kind of give up some of our old ways of thinking. And I say we, I'm a former military officer. I worked in procurement, capability development. We're always trying to gold plate stuff. Good enough is good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And good enough means it's effective.
There's a part here that I feel like is kind of flying under the radar, and it's so important, is you guys are tied in directly to the end user, and you're adapting in real time. And I think that's I think we're missing one of the lessons learned out of this war, and we're focused on just low cost items or the volume of items or how tanks and aircraft carriers are now vulnerable, when I think the bigger takeaway needs to be, we need to adapt quickly and talk to the guys using it. And you know what, for the United States and for the UK and for some countries in NATO, the use cases in Ukraine might not be the same that we need. So it's not that we need to exactly replicate the Ukrainian military, not by a long shot, but we have to take some of these lessons away, like you guys are doing, work with the end user and be able to adapt quickly, which easier said than done. I know, but it seems like company after company that hit the news about a brand new drone innovation and it doesn't work. And the minute they get into a contested environment, I talked to somebody recently that was putting together something. I'll actually keep the details. The good person trying to do his best. So I'm not going to go into it and try to put him on blast. But he was proposing a solution that has no viable use on the battlefield, and their company was building it. And it's like, stop. It's going to waste money. You're going to waste energy. You're going to waste all of that stuff. Nobody needs the thing that you're putting together. Long rant to say, I love that you guys are working with the end user. Hopefully that's something that the UK, the US, and everyone can really pick up on.
And I think it's that the willingness for the end user to work with you as well, or be allowed to work with you. One of the frustrations I had back in the UK previously is, your chances of interacting with the end user and doing something meaningful with the end user are so limited. You might even have to win a competition, do all the paperwork and be sifted through.
Have the product before you can meet them. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you've created this thing, maybe by speaking to people, but ultimately it's been magicked up in your little shed or or planning session or whatever it might be. And you've really got to have the humility to go, you've got to either have a great idea or you've got to have a prototype product that the users can actually get their hands on and do. And they must be informed users. But then you've got to have the humility to say, right, you know best. You're using it. Tell us, use it. Tell us what's wrong. Let's watch you do stuff. Let's and learn. And if they tell you that you're bonkers with the use case that you dreamt up in your head, if you are dogmatic and stick to that, no, I'm absolutely right, and we'll fight this through, you're not going to get anywhere. So you kind of have to see that, because the warfare is evolving constantly, and you've got to be there to evolve to what's happening now and what's happening next. Because if you have a very slow process, you're not agile, and you're developing for the past, then you're just going to be left behind. And the procurement from nice PowerPoint presentations and trying to get your project funded aren't really, I think, are going to happen. Certainly not in this space. Aren't going to happen going forward either. So it's that move to the customer, being the military, changing and giving a willingness to interact, to experiment with industry readily. That we know there's no commitment from them to buy it, but it's invaluable to companies to get that interaction and to get real current soldiers using it. Because I'm 5 years out of the military, and I feel like I've been out of it for decades. It's evolving that fast. So you can't have some old timer saying, "Oh, we used to do it like this." It's got to be you got to be evolving it for today or for tomorrow. And then secondly, it's got to be a willingness for industry to change, because I agree with you that we might not fight the same way. I think sometimes I've heard a lot of Western officers with an arrogance say, "Oh, of course, well, we won't fight like Ukraine." I went on a large number of operational tours, and we never fought the way we chose to fight. The enemy has a vote, so you don't ever fight via your doctrine. Things evolve, but sort of, we don't know future conflict's going to go and then how it's going to evolve. But industry's got to say, we get that, and you don't want to stock your shelves with kit that could be obsolete. But you want an industry which is agile and innovates with you. So there's got to be give and take on both sides. Industry's got to be willing to do stuff like we're doing, put yourself closer to the fight, to work in much more dangerous environments to deliver forward. And then the customer has got to be much more willing to say to industry who are doing that, and they want them there to be able to scale when they need it. Do you know what? We don't want you to build a load of kit, but what we're going to do is we're going to pay your engineering hours, or we're going to pay you to keep innovating stuff for us that we know we're not going to bring into core, into major programs of record. But what we are going to do is going to keep paying you to innovate. Your supply chains stay current, so that you keep refreshing stuff, so that when the time comes that we need you, you're there. Because if it's all boom and bust, you get a big contract, you scale up, you finish the contract, you scale down, your lines might go cold. The supply chain is what's going to kill you in a time of crisis. So you've got to keep that throughput going through industry, and you've got to keep them. You've got to keep the workforce energized as well, because the other key bit is, and I've experienced this in the past, guys can get bored if they've got nothing to do. Your good staff, the people who really want to be innovating and doing stuff, they're going to get bored if you don't have exciting projects to get after, or you aren't doing things, and they'll go to the next person who's won a big contract and wants to do it.
Something I'm nervous about in line with that, Mark, is we kind of have the idea that when the time comes, we will be able to adapt. We will, no problem. We were going to build 100,000 artillery shells a month, but we're not at war. So when push comes to shove, we certainly could do that. A report came out, I think yesterday, saying this new modification to get to 100,000 shells a month by October of last year, we're at 35,000 or something, way, way short. And that makes me nervous, that we're putting too many eggs in the basket of when we really need to, we can. Don't worry about us for right now. But either way, there's another interesting aspect here that you guys are doing is kind of building this for Ukraine. You're not just building a good product, you're building a product that Ukraine will be able to use into the future, including the supply chain. Would you be able to talk to that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said, it's our intellectual property that we've created, where we use components, be it cameras, thermal cameras, Raspberry Pi as our processor. Those things aren't going to change, and they can be brought in like anywhere else. But all the elements that we've designed within the hardware, we are localizing, and we're not just going into final assembly or anything like that in Ukraine. We're going into full scale manufacture here in Ukraine. We'll get the supply chain that is external flowing, but we want to minimize that. And it's amazing what's happened in Ukraine. They have created their own industries to replace the things that were problems for them in the supply chain. Be it motors, be it other elements of the UAV industry. So they've really focused on components on that front. There's no reason for us not to build it in Ukraine. There are various duty levies for certain components that you bring in, but there are stuff that we would potentially bring in that we'd have to pay additional duty on. But much better to be doing it here, because also that means then that if our PCBA is made here and we need to change it, we can change it directly with the manufacturer. We're not doing it over Zoom calls or whatever it might be, and then trying to get stuff shipped in with that. Even if it's a 3-week delay while something, and that would be very, very quick, while something is changed. If you can do it in 3 days here, that's the speed you need to be operating at.
Now, I know supply chains get very, very complicated, and there's a lot of pieces that move into that involve, the production of anything you guys are building. But if I remember correctly, you were talking about building as much as possible there. So nobody has that switch to turn it off and say, we are no longer shipping this item to Ukraine. How has that affected the price piece? Because it feels like you would have to choose more expensive items then over, say, for example, a Chinese.
Yes, it's more expensive than Chinese. So let's take thermal cameras as a good example, because we know that the price differences, it can be enormous there. Well, there are now a couple of Ukrainian producers using the highest quality cores and making their own cameras here, who have a very, very reasonable price point, much cheaper than we could get, in Europe, cheaper than we could even get in the US. And then also, we're not worrying about the problem that even at our scale, we are not going to be a customer to somebody like Fleur who is going to change the dial for them. What America is doing with drone dominance is amazing, but if we'd have gone for the Fleur Boson as our thermal camera of choice, I think we'd be at the bottom of a very long demand list of people trying to buy it right now. Whereas, the suppliers for our thermal cameras are in country, are doing it, and they are really ramping up their production to really impressive numbers, and it's a really, really good price point. It's not as good as the Chinese. Sorry, it's not as cheap as the Chinese. It's much better quality at the moment. I think the Chinese, they are amazing. They're catching up in so many areas, and it may well be an area they can close. But the high quality European supplier of tubes and obviously the US, definitely have a quality differential in that area, as one example.
Are there any examples of, I'm thinking of manufacturing specifically for like one-way strike drones, where maybe thermal camera is a good example, maybe again, where those are not built for one-time use. They're built for over and over and over and to maybe last for years. Is there any way that some of this stuff is now being manufactured in a way where it cuts costs because it's flying one way and it's not coming back? I don't know if that question makes sense.
It does make sense, and maybe it is, but not that I've seen. So for something like that, the quality control you need to make it, and these, we're integrating those type of cameras into a system that may be for one-time use, but it may go onto a system. I spoke about that example of if somebody was resupplying a brigade, in any Western military, they'd want those resupplies to be going as many times as possible. And Ukraine looks at that. It looks at how many missions an ISR drone does. It looks at how many missions a bomber drone does. It looks at how many missions and that's a metric of success. The logistic resupply. These are not single-use items. So, but when it comes down to the one-way strike, that's why systems like ours will never be used on FPV type drones, realistically, because the range of them is not sufficient to justify it, and there's no point putting on a system which is more expensive than an FPV drone itself. To do that when an operator can just fly it. So there's other ways of skinning that cat. I think when you start getting into the mid and the deep, then it starts becoming worth it, and the cost of those systems overall goes up significantly as well, and then we become a much smaller percentage of the overall cost of the system.
And maybe the last one here, Mark, there's an industry and a need right now in Ukraine. At some point, hopefully soon, this war comes to a close and Ukraine is does not need to buy the volume of drones they are. What then? Are you guys able to shift this model to provide the same technology for NATO countries? I would imagine, kind of like Ukraine doesn't want all of their products built around the world, the UK, France, Germany probably don't want all of their products built in Ukraine. What does that look
like? So ours is UK intellectual property. That we can replicate this model. We happen to be doing it in Ukraine, but we can do and it's not, our daytime system is not export controlled, our nighttime is. We can replicate that anywhere we would like, in the world, or we could build it, in our home base in the UK and then ship it to friendly countries. I see a scenario, and I hope it comes soon, that there is a piece of some kind here. To relieve the poor people of Ukraine from the suffering they've been going through, but I don't see the threat going away. And right now, certainly from my perspective, Ukraine is doing Europe's fighting it's its tripwire for itself. Some of the European nations are scaling really rapidly to try and be ready for when that piece comes. Others need to get ramping up much quicker than they are now. We are there to fill that demand with a system that has been kite marked, from Ukraine, to then go and capitalize or help those countries scale up thereafter. And then obviously we'll be able to also look to do this model anywhere else we like in the world. If there's opportunities in outside of Europe, in America, in other countries that we wish to go and work with, clearly we can do that. And we can, everybody wants sovereignization. That's probably not a real English word, but everybody wants the stuff built in their own country now to secure their own supply chain. We bring the intellectual property, but we can build our hardware just as we're doing in Ukraine anywhere. We can change our cameras. Raspberry Pis are pretty universal, where you can get them. PCBAs can generally be built in quite a lot of places. And the other elements can definitely be built anywhere. We can replicate this anywhere where we need to afterwards. I don't see the world getting any less dangerous, even if a ceasefire or a peace comes to Ukraine in the near term.
It's fascinating. It's not just the technology, but the way you're going about building it and innovating. It's all pretty unique. So Mark, thank you so much for what you and your team are doing, and thank you for talking through all this today.
I really enjoyed it.
All right, man. We'll talk soon. All right, so thank you so much to Mark for taking the time to walk through all that, and to Bruno for putting us in touch. Great introduction there, man. And look, this is something that's been top of mind for me for a while. Again, we hear that Ukraine is leading the way when it comes to drone warfare, and I think a lot of folks in the United States brush that aside and think we can certainly build whatever it is they're building. We can innovate whatever they're innovating. The tech, we can do it. They don't have Silicon Valley. They don't have the manufacturing base that we do. That's all correct, but the bigger issue here is, are we solving the right problem at the right time? And I don't know. I mean, test after test that have come out shows that U.S. drones going over to Ukraine are not keeping up with Russian electronic warfare, or they're not able to maintain their same specs in a combat environment. So it's a mindset shift that we have to have around the world. NATO countries here in the United States as well. Our procurement process to deployment is so slow and has historically been so slow, it will not work today. So whether people follow the path of Delian here, or they have other routes of going about this, that's a positive direction. We have to become more adaptable. We have to close that feedback loop even tighter and have the direct communication with soldiers at the front that are using the technology. That's the only way to stay up to date in this rapidly changing environment. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.